Desperate measures in Venezuela as President Maduro sells off his country's gold reserves. The latest buyer is reportedly the United Arab Emirates. So is the UAE now at risk of US sanctions? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Martine. Now, the economic crisis in Venezuela has forced millions of people to leave the country. They can't afford basic goods like food and medicine. President Nicolas Maduro has responded by using the country's gold reserves in an attempt to pay for these imports. Now, the Reuters news agency says he's planning to sell 29 tonnes of gold this month from the central bank vaults to the United Arab Emirates in return for cash in euros. A former central bank governor believes two Russian chartered planes, which landed in Caracas on Monday, had been hired to take the gold out of the country. Well, Maduro's government hasn't commented on these reports. But the United States is watching all of this rather closely. The Republican Senator Marco Rubio, he's warned against dealing in Venezuelan gold. And in a tweet to the UAE's embassy in Washington, he wrote, "We have reports that a French national working for Noor Capital is in Caracas today to arrange for the theft of more gold from Venezuela. I hope you have advised them that they and any air charter service that does this will be subject to Treasury sanctions." Noor Capital is a financial services firm that's based in Abu Dhabi. Well, the US imposed sanctions last November to disrupt Venezuela's sale of gold. Between January and September last year, Venezuela exported $900 million worth of unrefined gold to Turkey. Nicolas Maduro's government wants to bring back $550 million worth of gold that's currently held in the Bank of England. But the Bank of England has so far refused that request. Venezuela's gold reserves fell from 150 tonnes last January to 132 tonnes in November. Right, let's introduce our guests now. Joining us from London is Middle East analyst Bill Law, who writes for the website Gulf Matters. Naeem Aslam is also in London. He's the chief market analyst at the online brokerage firm Think Markets. Thank you both for joining us. And Naeem, can I start with you? What does it indicate about the state of a government, the state of a country, when the leader is going to the country's gold reserves and flogging them off?
It only represents one thing, a big chaos. And now you are trying to go around the current sanctions imposed, and in order to find a solution to provide some liquidity in the market, because the current sanctions have brought Venezuela to its knees, right? Because they can't really export oil, which is the commodity for the country, and they have no other solution but to go and start selling the gold reserves. And it's not the first time, just for the record, it's not the first time that we have seen such actions taking place by any government, because we have seen that many other governments following the similar strategy when they need that liquidity, when they need currency, when they need other currencies.
But Naeem, is it actually legal? I mean, aren't there certain permissions, certain requirements that need to be in place before, in this case, a president who's widely disputed, being able to go to the central bank, open up the vaults with his key and take out the gold bars?
Look, I'm in no position to make a comment whether it is legal or whether it isn't. But what I can certainly say is that the government, it's a normal practice for central banks to sell assets such as precious metal, gold, to do that. But whether he has the right permissions, whether he can do that, I cannot comment on it. Right. But yes, that supply is going to come on the market.
Right. All right, Bill. Now, we understand from this Reuters report that the UAE is perhaps the latest customer. We think even within this space of 24 hours that there is likely to be a shipment of Venezuelan gold to Abu Dhabi. Is Is the UAE in any danger, do you think, then, of being imposed or being slapped with sanctions as threatened by Marco Rubio, the Republican senator?
Well, Martine, that was what Marco Rubio threatened, but I think the reality is something else, really, because the UAE is a key element in Donald Trump's strategy to really make the toughest sanctions ever against Iran. And so I don't think that it would pay the U.S. any good to slap any sanctions. I really look upon this as a kind of a shot across the bow. Perhaps it's a case of the left hand not knowing what the right hand is doing. We have this Noor capital in Abu Dhabi, apparently, allegedly being a part of this major shipment of gold from Venezuela. But equally, you have a situation where the United Arab Emirates, and if you go back in history, has been very active in gold issues involving sanctions and involving Iran. And indeed, Turkey was part of that deal as well. And Turkey, as we know, Venezuela has been selling gold to Turkey. But to answer your question, I don't expect that the United States would come down too hard on the Emirates.
Right, now we're being joined by Tom Long. He's at the University of Warwick. He's Associate Professor of Politics and International Studies there, and we can hear from him. Thank you very much, Tom, for joining us. What do you make of the state of play in Caracas at the moment? I mean, we've been talking about the state of health of the economy, clearly is in a dire condition, but the fact that the head of state, because that is what he still is at this point, is able to go and take the country's gold reserves and sell them on the open market, because that's apparently what he's doing.
Clearly, the state of the economy in Venezuela is beyond dire. It was already dire before the United States imposed oil sanctions, and those oil sanctions will unfold gradually, but could potentially have quite a lot of bite. Despite the conflict between the United States and Venezuela over a decade or more, the United States, as of a few days ago, was still buying about 40% of Venezuela's oil and was overwhelmingly the customer that was paying for that oil in cash. So with those payments coming to a quick end, I think this is a response from the Maduro government to try to get its hands on some liquid assets by selling this gold on the market as quickly as it can.
And let's go to Naeem in London. Naeem, we talk about the sale of this gold injecting a certain amount of liquidity in practical terms in the economy. What is the sale of this gold allowing the Caracas government to do? What are they using the money to buy?
Well, look, I think that the first question is that why they are really dealing with euros, because right now what the intentions are that they only wanted to sell the gold, whatever the quantity that they want to offload, only in euros. And the reason that they are going after euros is because they completely wanted to avoid anything to do with the US dollar. I think it's a huge threat to the US dollar as a benchmark currency. And then I've said this many times before, that euro is going to become another major benchmark currency. And that is the reason that they are going after euros, because everything is denominated when everything is denominated in euros, you can easily make transactions without the US system getting involved into that. So for Venezuela, if you look at the country's balance sheet, it, as you said, it's absolutely dire. They have literally no money to pay anything. So for them to get access to euros and then to get involved in the euro banking system is the key requirement right now in order to avoid all the sanctions which are imposed on them by the United States.
Now, Tom, coming back to you, earlier, rather unfairly, I put the question to Naeem, which is not really his area, but I'll put it to you because I think you'll be able to help us. What are the sort of permissions, the sort of consents that are needed for the head of state to go to what are state assets, these gold reserves that are kept in the central bank in Caracas? What normally needs to happen?
Well, at this point, there are really no normal procedures about what needs to happen. This is something that is happening largely at the discretion of Nicolas Maduro and his inner circle. There is a legislative body created by Maduro that was put over the elected National Assembly, but that's essentially a rubber stamp body. I do think that there is something quite important here about the gold oil nexus, and I agree with the comments about avoiding the US dollar and focusing on euros. But these sanctions from the United States have another really important aspect to them, and that's that they prohibit the export of US oil to Venezuela. And that sounds a little bit odd when we think about Venezuela as, of course, a large oil exporter. But it needs to import U.S. light crude to mix with Venezuelan heavy crude to be able to produce and export and ship its oil. So now it has a crunch to be able to acquire that light crude from elsewhere, and it needs funds to pay for that light crude in order to keep its oil industry producing.
Right, OK, so the pressure is really mounting, isn't it? Naeem, very quickly back to you. So I just want to ask you about this issue of transparency. I mean, it all seems very opaque. The whole dealing of gold, and there are chartered planes that have taken a rather circuitous route to Caracas at some small out-of-town airfield. Is there not a transparency exchange, if you like, by which and through which gold is traded?
Nick, when we are talking about assets like gold, there is no transparency. And that's just the reality of it. And especially when you are trying to avoid a certain situation, and under this particular situation, we are speaking of sanctions, we have to deal with something what you called discount, illiquidity discount premium, because there are not enough buyers. You are trying to avoid the system. You're trying to attract buyers which are not part of the financial system. How do you attract them? You give them a massive discount, anywhere between 3% to 10%. And then when the asset itself is gold, and then if the physical presence in gold bar, if you melt that, who knows where the gold, where the asset is coming from? So there is absolutely no transparency.
And that brings me neatly back to Bill, because what do we know about this Noor Capital, this financial services organisation? And apparently, according to Marco Rubio, has a French national who's been brokering this deal.
Yes, it's all very murky, isn't it? Which as your other contributor noted, is very much part of the sanctions game, and gold plays a very important role in that. The United Arab Emirates authorities say that they have cracked down on money laundering and the lack of transparency in their banking sector. The fact of the matter is that though they've said it, they actually haven't done much about it. Transparency International, for example, says that Dubai is a magnet for money laundering from a variety of sources, including criminal gangs, and this is done through real estate purchases. Again, what facilitates the getting around of sanctions is, first of all, that gold is a very useful metal to have, and secondly, the lack of transparency within the United Arab Emirates and other jurisdictions as well. I would think that the Emirates may be reconsidering. They certainly have got themselves into this situation. The Americans are not best pleased. I can hear John Bolton throwing himself around in deep irritation, because the last thing he wants to see is undercutting of sanctions in Venezuela, because that then weakens potentially what can happen with sanctions moving forward against Iran. But the situation still has a ways to play out, and one of the challenges that I think everyone faces is this opacity, this lack of transparency that makes it very difficult to find out who exactly the players are. What we do know is that these transactions in gold, it means that money is made by the intermediaries all along the way, wherever it ends up. There's a lot of dirty money that people are pulling out of these transactions.
And Tom, when reading...
To add something
Oh,
to
sorry,
that.
Naeem, please come in, yes.
Sorry, yes, I just wanted to add something to that. I think it is, I agree that there are intermediaries involved at every single stage, but I think at the same time we shouldn't discount the factor that how UAE is bringing transparency to this system by using blockchain technology, right? Because Dubai wants to become a paperless economy altogether. So they are applying all the technologies to which brings the transparency, and it would be unfair just to point all the guns to UAE and then saying that, look, you know, this is the hub for doing all sort of shady businesses. I don't think that is the fair comment by just putting all the blame on the UAE. And of course, the government is very well aware of it, and the government is going to ward off every single anything which is coming to us them, and then they're not going to allow that.
Yeah,
if a particular player...
I take your point, because, of course, in many ways, the sanctions that were imposed in November last year were in direct response from the United States to the gold sales that were made with Turkey over the space of 2018, weren't they? Tom, I was just going to ask you whether... it seems very much as though the UAE, in this particular instance, is offering some sort of rescue plan to Nicolas Maduro. Does this mean that the government, the state of the United Arab Emirates, is siding with Nicolas Maduro? Because, of course, the world is divided between the self-declared interim president and, indeed, Mr. Maduro.
Well, I think it's pretty hard to tell exactly what the UAE's longer-term diplomatic interests in this might be, but you could certainly imagine that they would be hesitant to recognize a sort of a claimant to the throne, so to speak, that there are lots of reasons why they would be standing up for international principles of sovereignty and non-intervention, and why they might see that system and principle as being in their interests. That said, I'm not sure that this is a long-term lifeline for Maduro. I think he is looking to get a little bit of breathing room from this purchase, again, to have some assets that allow him to reconfigure oil production and oil exports in Venezuela in a way that might allow him to survive the U.S. sanctions regime.
Right. And Naeem, coming back to you, so it must make sort of economic sense then for somebody who's drowning at the moment like Nicolas Maduro. But what about the ethics of selling off what are essentially it's like the family silver, isn't it? The country's wealth is being sold off in order to buy toilet paper, for instance.
Yeah, look, in terms of ethics, there are no ethics when you start dipping into your reserves, gold reserves, right? That's just simple as that, because you do not want it to sell. Like, if you look at central banks, their buying of gold as an asset over in 2018, the number stands at 70% increase in gold at the physical buying of gold. So central banks are trying to buy gold off the market, right? Because they know there's a huge debt crisis is just on the horizon. So if a country like Venezuela is trying to sell those assets, of course, the question of ethics is just out of the window. Yeah, definitely that is completely wrong. But if, as I agree with the comments, but if they are just trying to reconfigure the economy and just trying to buy some breathing room, then they do not have any other option just to go and then sell some of those assets that they consider as a reserve assets.
And Bill, you mentioned earlier that this is clearly going to irritate John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and the rest of them, at the very least. How would you characterise the state of relations between Washington and Abu Dhabi at the moment, given that they have been very close allies, haven't they, since the UAE was formed in 1971?
Yes, close allies, and particularly given Mohammed bin Zayed's very strong support for sanctions against Iran, and that's part of a whole attitude that sees Iran as an existential threat. That the Saudis very much share that view as well. I think that this is something of potentially, if it's a one-off, it's a minor irritant. I suppose if the Emiratis decided to keep doing this and Maduro, because of his difficult situation, decided to keep selling to them, then the Americans could become a little more annoyed. But I think at this stage, there'll be some behind-the-scenes questioning of what exactly the Emiratis are up to. I think with Marco Rubio hinting at sanctions in his email, or in his tweet rather, that didn't come from Mike Pompeo or from Bolton or indeed from the tweet master himself, Donald Trump. So I think it is very much just part of a, hey, hang on here, what do you guys actually think you're up to? And I think you need to be looking a little more seriously at Noor Capital, for example, and saying, maybe you don't want to be buying any more of Venezuela's gold, because the Americans want to force regime change using sanctions in Venezuela. And of course, what do the Americans want to do with sanctions against Iran? Certainly, John Bolton wants to force regime change. These situations are completely different. There is no strong, although there are concerns in Iran about the level of incompetence of that government and high unemployment, it's nothing near to the situation that Venezuela is in. It's much more likely that the Americans can force regime change in Venezuela. But I think they would see this as, meddling in an area that they, for the United Arab Emirates, just butts out of. So stay away from purchasing gold from Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Right, and Tom, we are seeing, aren't we, what is a repeat of a historical interference by the United States into what it considers to be its own backyard. I'm just wondering what stage you think we might be at. How long can Maduro hang on? Do you think he will retain the loyalty of the military?
Right. I mean, that is the crucial question. One quick note that I would add about reserve assets in Venezuela is that this is not necessarily a new practice. We've seen Venezuela essentially leveraging all sorts of overseas assets prior to the previous round of financial sanctions. And that's part of what those sanctions were aimed at. That is leveraging U.S. Oil assets, Venezuelan oil assets in the United States, such as Citgo. In terms of Maduro and how long he can hang on, you're right. The crucial element here is the loyalty of the military. And the military is not a homogenous bloc in Venezuela. There is a high command that is very closely connected to Maduro and is likely to remain supportive of this government as long as it can, because it is united with Maduro in sort of an unholy triad of things. Many of these high-ranking officials are also indicted for drug trafficking violations by the United States and others. Or suspected of involvement in drug trafficking, suspected of involvement or complicit in human rights violations, and have been closely wed to the government's economic policy. However, below the high command, there are certainly some signs that there are divisions in the officer corps, and that lower levels of the Venezuelan military are less willing to respond to commands from on high, from Maduro, particularly if it comes to repressing protests, repressing their fellow Venezuelans.
All
so
right.
there are those tensions there, but they are within the Venezuelan military at different levels.
Thank you all very much indeed. We've run out of time. Bill Law in London, Tom Long in Warwick, and Naeem Aslam also in London. Thank you all very much indeed for a really interesting conversation and hopefully shed some light on the murky world of gold trading. Thank you very much for watching the programme. You can see it again anytime you like by going to the website, aljazeera.com. Should you want more discussion, you can either go to our Facebook page, that's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story, and there's always a Twitter sphere as well. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. I'm @Martine Dennis. From me and the whole team here in Doha, it's bye for now.